We're live with just a week before the draft. So next Thursday at this time, we'll all be really excited, and we'll be wondering who is the number one receiver. We'll find that out from Matt Harmon and more this week on the couch. Matt Harmon, next week at this time, you'll be in Nashville and maybe hearing the name of the number one receiver in this draft, which is still a bit of a mystery. But what is not a mystery, your number one receiver, Mr. Reception Perception, after looking at this always intriguing class.
Yeah, this is probably one of the more fascinating classes we've had over the last few years. I think, back in 2017, we had the surprise of all of those wide receivers going in the top 10. And looking back on it, I guess the only one that's been, I don't know that Corey Davis definitely has not played up to the fifth overall pick, right? Although he was certainly everybody's consensus number one wide receiver. Mike Williams, I actually think, kind of gets a bad rap after going back and looking at his game from this past year. I was actually more impressed than I thought I was going to be. It's just John Ross is the one that's like, oh my God, the ultimate eye roll of John Ross. But there have been good contributors that have come from the next wave of that. And that to me is the way this draft sets up too, is that I think there's a ton of second round receivers that are going to go. I could see a small run happening in the second round, maybe even late second round into third round, because there's so many guys that are just good potential contributors. The one to me, I think, who stands out, because I think he is the most easy to translate, easy to project to the NFL, probably the safest prospect of all these guys, is Ole Miss's AJ Brown to me.
Nice.
I love AJ Brown's game.
Really quick, let me interject. Is Juju, because something we'll continue to talk about, because I love the way you immediately, your mind when we talked about the draft, went to a previous draft and talked about you summoned up pictures of watching these players in the pros. So you get to have your view of them at this precipice of the draft, but then you're also going back and reviewing these guys. And then I'm sure it's causing you to revise your own framework of evaluation. And Juju Smith-Schuster, I think, is a player that had, I'll admit myself and others going back to the drawing board, did his success influence how you see AJ Brown?
His success, and I think you could say the same thing with a player like Cooper Kupp from that year. Although Cooper Kupp is fascinating. Actually, but this is the funny thing about the wide receiver position. And Sigmund, it's really good to be on the couch with you, because I know I can swirl this discussion in a
have an out of body experience, rise above yourself and look down at yourself.
Right. Like, we can really go a lot of different directions with this. And the wide receiver position, I think, provides us so many avenues to do just that. And Cooper Kupp and Juju Smith-Schuster, for one, like, if they had landed in different positions, like, I think, who knows what we're even talking about, like Cooper
Buffalo.
Cooper Kupp with anybody but, the LA Rams and Sean McVay and how he schemes receivers. Maybe we wouldn't be talking about him as a guy that, like, people really, really love and respect Cooper Kupp. I found that out from tweeting out wide receiver duos this week, and everyone wants me to mention Cooper Kupp. And maybe it's just absence has made the heart grow fond of this player. Mm-hmm. Although I do think he's a very good, really good receiver in the NFL. Same with Juju Smith-Schuster, because to me, if he had been tried as an X receiver at the NFL or early in his career, I think he would have failed. I don't think he would have, maybe not to, like, forever, but I don't think he would have been the type of player that we think of him as today. If he had been tried as an X receiver, go face press coverage on a majority of your routes, play the Antonio Brown role, play even a Marvin Jones type of role. And that is something that I think those two players, that draft class in particular, taught me. And really, it's something, just the evolution of reception perception. I say this all the time, that if I really wanted to do reception perception as what I think it is, like almost like an academic study, of sampling all of these players, testing this data. I would have charted data for like 5 years before ever publishing a conclusion. But of course, that doesn't work, Sigmund, because then, the audience needs a take, right? Like I couldn't.
Or the entertainment business.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I couldn't have said back in 2014, when you discovered reception perception in my work and stuff like that, that winter of 2013 into early 2014, been like, hey man, trust me, I've got something really good cooking, but I'll tell you about it in 5 years. But trust me, that wouldn't have worked. But through doing this over multiple years, I've really learned more about the wide receiver position, further and further on. And I think that the one thing that those guys and players of that ilk have really changed my opinion on is just the importance of deployment and where these guys line up and how you can take a player like a Juju Smith-Schuster who was a big outside receiver at the college level and move him inside and find ways for his weaknesses really to not matter all that much because
Right.
I still don't think he's good against press or man coverage. But who cares because he faces that on, reception perception would show you he faces zone coverage more than most receivers. He doesn't face press coverage on more than 25, 28% of his routes. And that's a huge difference maker for these receivers. So those group of guys, I think, have taught me more than almost any other players at the position. And it opens up my imagination and the possibilities for other receivers in this class for sure.
Yeah. So as I derailed you, and it's great too because you're immediately taking a tangent off to that surprise top 10 trio 2 years in, and it reminds us in Juju and Cup that, like you said, deployment situation. And I went on a rant recently on Twitter, just that judging draft analysts by whether they nail how early or late a player goes, or even the outcome picture of the range of possibilities and a stab at what kinds of external factors will get them on the upper range and what could get them on the lower range. Like you said, play to the weaknesses or play to the strengths. And John Ross is a great example of, like, well, Marvin Lewis is out of Cincinnati now, and who knows how much he never seemed to like him. Maybe that's part of what's going on there. Corey Davis, the surroundings, that offense, how much of a player's career outcome is a function of where they landed.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not interesting when we're talking about the draft, because we want to talk about the part that the players control, which is the players themselves. But AJ Brown and Juju Smith-Schuster is brought up in my mind when I look at AJ Brown, Matt, because of toughness and because of awareness and because of a sense of making efficient, correct decisions with all of these different situations that he is presented with on the field, and playing with, size, enough size, just like Juju, not the fastest, not the most powerful, not the shiftiest there's nothing that he's going to rate first in when you're breaking it down by category, and yet there he is first in the class. And maybe I also wonder, Matt, because we talk a lot when we evaluate quarterbacks about their play outside of structure and how important that is, right? We don't talk a lot about that with wide receivers.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
talk about only play within structure. So AJ Brown.
Yeah, I mean, to think about a receiver like Doug Baldwin and how good he is at playing outside of structure, along with a quarterback that thrives outside of structure, and that's huge, especially for those interior guys who, like I said, looking through reception perception history, there's a clear trend of these slot receivers facing more zone coverage. I mean, that's just the nature of the position. That's why I think it's smart for teams like the LA Chargers, the New Orleans Saints to take these receivers like Keenan Allen and Michael Thomas that I think could thrive on the outside, but have them play inside more because the matchups are just so much better from the slot. And same with when you line them up off the line of scrimmage at the flanker position. And I think that's the thing with AJ Brown to me that stands out is I think that he has much better release moves coming out of college than a player like Juju did. I think he can, if you had to throw him outside, maybe you don't want to throw him out as an X receiver, but certainly as a flanker, I think if he's going to face press coverage, on around 30% of his routes, 35%. I think that's totally doable for him. Again, I think his strength is as an interior receiver where he just sifts through things so well. He finds open holes in zones, and he's just such a good, secure player. And I think there's so many landing spots for him. I think about the Colts as a spot that would be perfect. Right? Like it's like salivating to a point
Mm-hmm.
because they have a guy like T.Y. Hilton who they like to use inside every now and again as a speed slot, and then you use him as the speed flanker. Well, now you get yourself a big slot and a big flanker that can alternate those positions when Hilton's doing the other thing. And then you have Devin Funchess doing whatever it is he's going to contribute as an X receiver, as more of a bit player. And I think there's so many possibilities for a player like Brown. No matter what you need out of your wide receiver core, I think he's going to bring you something, which to me is why I like him the best out of this class.
That's beautiful. And I saw Penny Hart was visiting the Colts, and that made me excited about harvesting value from that slot position. And another commonality in all these situations too is a smart, aware quarterback, and that kind of player can harvest a lot more of the value that quarterback creates. So yeah, AJ Brown and Indy would be beautiful. And also just all the things that my mind's summoning up when you made that connection, Matt, is a great offensive mind in Frank Reich, an attitude of wanting to have 7, 8, 9 different weapons to deploy at a defense, right? Like multiple tight ends, a dedicated receiving running back, and maybe 3 running backs, 4 receivers, which they've been lacking. But adding that, and they just brought back Chester Rogers. You see teams being able to deploy a variety of weapons, and what that does, Matt, is hopefully it reduces any pressure to miscast a player. You
Yeah.
know, to think of your offense in terms of roles. Your offense isn't roles. Your offense is what element does this player bring? How can we mix it with the other elements we have to distort a defense and punch holes in it? And absolutely, and again, I want to say this, and there's a lot of great people doing great work about wide receiver. It's, Brad Kelly comes to mind right away. There's a lot of great discussions about wide receiver. And this class, dare I say, Matt, has been the best for fomenting vigorous and revealing conversations about these receivers, because the opinions are so widely ranging. They're polarizing. So tell me if you're aware of some of the conversations about these wide receivers, one of these polarizing discussions that you feel like you fall in line with a camp when you see the polarization.
Yeah, no, it's one of those classes that I think you're not only detailing your thoughts on this class and these particular players, but you're detailing your thoughts and your opinions on the position as a
Yeah,
whole,
every
which
time.
is which is great because I think there's no position, maybe I'm biased, but I think there's no position more intellectually stimulating in terms of what you can do with them, the possibilities and the wide range of opinions in general than the wide receiver group. I mean, because like I put this chart out recently, or a couple months ago, of again how Juju Smith-Schuster lines up and how Antonio Brown lines up, and then the types of coverages that they face. Simply, despite being on the field at the same time, despite being on the same team, the types of coverages that they're going to face, the type of defenders that they're going to face, simply because of where they line up. And I basically said, like, they might as well be playing different positions. Like, their assignments are so
Yes.
drastically different. And we see that all throughout the NFL. Multiple tandems are like that. And that's what's so exhilarating about this position. And one player that I definitely think I come down with a really strong take on, and I know I guess he's polarizing because some people really, really like him, and others I don't hear him mentioned all that much, is Miles Boykin from Notre Dame. I mean, I think he has the best film of the big outside receivers, right? Like, there's definitely been the thought this year that, like, the big receivers are back. These guys with size and ability to get down the field and win as X receivers. Those guys are back after maybe falling out of the pack, especially last year's draft for sure. But Boykin, to me, I think of all the guys I've studied to kind of fit into that dichotomy, he is the one who gets off the line of scrimmage the best. He's the one who gets downfield separation the best. I think there are some areas for him to work on, especially, I've been trying to use reception perception since I can't chart these players, because I'm no longer at the NFL Network anymore. RIP, the college reception perception film database. But I've been trying to use it, like, to show how, like, who they compare to in my mind and how they might be best used. One guy who stood out with Miles Boykin was Kenny Galladay. Kenny Galladay, to me, showed a lot of really good things as a rookie, but one thing that always got on my nerves was his really poor contested catch rate, because I don't think he was great about extending his arms outside of his body and being able to snare off-target passes. I see Boykin do that occasionally, but I also see some holes with that. But Galladay from year 1 to year 2 had a massive improvement in terms of his reception perception, contested catch rate. And I think that Boykin, if he irons that out of his game, he could do a similar job to Kenny Galladay, which is kind of being a low end number 1 wide receiver for a team after basically everybody else was injured or jettisoned. So Boykin, to me, is the one I come down strong on him. I think he's a top 3 receiver in this class for sure, but definitely of the big wideouts, he's my favorite one for sure.
Yeah, Revenge of the Big Whiteouts. And your conversation is echoing on one that I had with Matt Waldman recently, too, about the segmenting. We talked about segmenting running back and segmenting of wide receiver. But
Yes.
but these 1 to 30 rankings are almost obsolete at wide receiver now. You really want to break it out based on the roles you can see them playing in an offense, and or even just physical types. You could even do a higher level sorting of the one without as much nuance, and just say, these body types, these set alignments of traits and hopefully skills, because that's one of the things about Miles Boykin. It's interesting to watch his trajectory over the course of the draft season, because you can go back to January and he was an afterthought in a lot of rankings, and then he has the incredible combine, breathtaking across the board. But that's not even what you and Matt Waldman and other people that are standing for Boykin are saying. You're saying it's the play, and it's great to be big and be a fluid, explosive mover. But where we're really excited is when that's married to skills at the position, and we can't ever forget those skills at the position as the thing that unlocks the value of those physical traits. And without that, the traits are wasted. How much of Hakeem Butler's amazing physical profile could be wasted in the NFL because of, I don't know, some concerns about releases or, a kind of receiver. And I'm not saying I would compare Hakeem Butler to John Baldwin, but Baldwin stands to me as that textbook example, right, Matt? Like, you're far enough in this now that we could do the textbook where you could say, like, here's an example of a critical point of failure in a player's game that makes all of the pluses in his game just evaporate when he's put on an NFL field. And we saw it with John Baldwin at Pitt, where he had all the physical tools you wanted, but he just didn't have a combativeness at the checkpoint. I mean, at the catch point, and just a certain kind of that pesky Brent Grimes type of smaller corner could stick to him and thwart him and frustrate him. Some may raise those concerns about Hakeem Butler. There's 1 year wonder. Hakeem Butler is probably the most polarizing prospect in this class. Where are you on the temperature scale?
Yeah, I haven't really talked about Hakeem Butler that much because I think he's been a really hard player to evaluate. And because, look, I don't come into this process without, Matt Waldman's great about this, right? Like, he's the consummate, like, I will really shut myself off from the rest of the world. I will really not know what everyone else thinks. Unfortunately, I'm a dumb millennial that's stuck on Twitter too often. So I see what people think of the player. And,
Right.
I read Matt's work. I talk to Daniel Jeremiah a good amount, about what he thinks. We go back and forth on players. I go back and forth on players with you, Sig. I go back and forth with players on a lot of different guys. Now, the really hard part about that is that you know what other people think when you're going to go and watch the player.
It influences you. It's impossible for it to not influence you.
Yeah, and when I see people say that Hakeem Butler has shades of AJ Green, and then I go watch Hakeem Butler, I'm almost offended because I just was talking about AJ Green the other day after finishing his reception perception sample. I think AJ Green might be the best over the last 5 years, the best big wide receiver in terms of gaining separation, route running, releases, all of that, especially of the guys, that mostly play at X receiver. I think he's been an absolutely transcendent player that has been kind of wasted in Cincinnati. And now we've seen injuries start to ruin the equation. Right. So I don't see that at all with Butler. I don't even know if I see that kind of potential or that many exciting signs of it. So one player that I came to mind, and I know this is going to seem offensive on the other end, because I just kind of slandered him earlier a tiny bit, but he definitely reminds me a lot of Devin Funchess because I see the fluidity with Butler. Everybody, I've heard that about the damn whip route against Iowa or whatever, 100 times listening to other podcasts. So, but that's a real great example of one play that really describes the player. I see the quick change of direction, the ability to get in and out of breaks, when everything's working right for Butler, no doubt about it. But you know what? Funchess, I'll go back to the 2017 season with Funchess because I think people really kind of have forgotten that year with him because of how poorly things ended in Carolina and how he's pretty much just shown the door and then everybody freaks out about $10 million and whatever. But Devin Funchess that year really started to look like he was finally figuring it out. He almost had 900 yards. I think he had 8 touchdowns. When they just sent Kelvin Benjamin packing, Funchess started to break out as that big X receiver. And it was by far the best I'd seen from him in terms of a route running perspective, in terms of winning the ball in the air. Both of those were backed up in reception perception. Not an elite separator or anything, but certainly a guy who could get in and out of breaks really well, especially on posts, on slants, on curl routes. He could come back to the quarterback really well. And I see all of those things with Butler. I see the ability to win the ball in the air. I mean, his catch radius is massive. I think that Butler has a good chance to become a really nice starting X receiver in the NFL. But I don't think he is, as others, a clear number one wide receiver. But I also think he's perfectly fine as like the fourth or fifth best in this class. I guess you could say I have a little bit of a centrist opinion
Yeah.
in our very partisan world on football Twitter.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think you gave us a great set of considerations to work with to understand Hakeem Butler there. Because I'll admit that I have mentioned Hakeem Butler and AJ Green in the same sentence. And what stands out to me is strictly an alignment, a rare alignment constellation of a long-limbed athlete who understands how to use his frame to win confrontations when the ball's in the air, who has, for that body type, elite straight line speed and plays with strength. And AJ Green is just the one player I can think of who checks those boxes. But you're right to say skills wise, and that AJ Green should get more love because AJ Green isn't necessarily, even though AJ Green has these great physical advantages on his counterparts, he's marrying that to tremendous skills at the position too. And for Hakeem Butler to hit that ceiling, he would have to make a quantum leap in those things. And that's a projection maybe that we're too eager to make. But maybe when we talk about Hakeem Butler, maybe it's that his ceiling is the top in the class. Although then there's DK Metcalf is like I'm saying, I'm right here in the room. But anyway, the point is that I think that's a great, and Devin Funchess, and I like that you say, hey, I'm bringing up Devin Funchess not to slam Butler, but to say he could still be a good player. And again, you put him in a good environment, right? Because we look good if you're positive on a player and he goes to a good team with a good offensive mindset and quarterback, you look good for saying that. And if you say you're negative on a player and he goes to some gulag, some desert of offense, then you look smart for saying that. Like if you were down on Corey Davis, it looks correct. This is again why I'm talking about divorcing when you say, well, here's my best guess of where a player will land on the range of outcomes, is being less meaningful than saying here's the range of outcomes and here's all the moving pieces that make it the way it is.
On Hakeem Butler, and the Devin Funchess thing. What's funny about like Cam Newton? We were talking about Aaron Rodgers and how he rides players too hard, and how he like puts people out of his good graces, and then you never get back in. Although Devontae Adams, I think, would beg to differ. Devontae Adams is the one player, as we're talking about this with Aaron Rodgers, but I don't want to get on a Devontae Adams tangent. I could because he's a player that I've come to really, really adore. The last really just year, but Cam Newton's kind of the opposite of that. Like he'll stick with the guy maybe to a fault. Like maybe to like Kelvin Benjamin, perfect example. He loved Kelvin Benjamin.
He walks up to him and tries to be like, "Hey, what?" And Benjamin,
clearly, Kelvin Benjamin doesn't love him back.
Right.
But like early in his career, I think you were the one who used to say this best. Like if Kelvin Benjamin gets with a quarterback who's going to just absolutely trust him and put all that faith in him, he will live through the Kelvin coaster. Remember those days back in his evaluation. I think that like, yeah, right. And that was really what Cam Newton did with him. And I think similar thing with Devin Funchess too, because Devin Funchess was a total dud for a little bit there. And finally, like I said, in that 2017 season, I think he started to harness some of his physical gifts and marry them with skills at the position. Because if you can't look, I don't care how athletic you are.
Right.
If you can't run routes, you can't get open, you can't get separation, you're not going to last in the league, even just because you're going to lose the faith of your quarterback and your coaching staff, and might as well be over at that point. You'll be Justin Hunter is the prime example. But Devin Funchess, I think, is a perfect example for Hakeem Butler because it might take a couple years for him to get there. And it took a couple of years for Devin Funchess to get there. And now we've seen kind of Funchess take another dip in his career. And I could see Hakeem Butler maybe in a similar path, going on an upward trajectory, having some peaks and valleys. But in the end, I really do see him settling in as long as all things go well. seeing him as a guy that does settle in as a nice starting X receiver in the league. I don't know. Even if he does have the highest range of outcomes in this class, I don't know that AJ Green is in that
Yeah,
range of outcomes.
maybe we should not include AJ Green in anyone's range of outcomes.
Yeah.
And I get carried away with myself sometimes. No, but look, Devin Funchess. This is turning into the Devin Funchess show, but he's been banged up. Even in the year that he was his breakout year, he was banged up, which is a negative, but also a sign that there's even more potential if that's not something that plagues him. Yeah, so there's a lot to look forward to, and it also reminds me that we used to say not that long ago, we don't evaluate receivers until 33 years in. And that's what's interesting too about your mind immediately going to Davis and Williams and Ross, because they're entering that third year that we used to say like 15, 20 years ago. Oh, you can't really judge a receiver until the third year. It's just the nature of the position.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the nature of the position is changing to some extent, but there are also players that you can say, again, to elucidate, like just getting what the player represents, that this is the kind of player that if it happens, it's going to happen in year 2 or year 3. This is the kind of player like AJ Brown, for instance, that can immediately, we were like our little back, just immediately upgrade the offense, especially if he has a good quarterback. So who else is, because you mentioned that you are somewhat aware because of who you talk to and what you see going on out there, what people are thinking. Who else is a receiver that you feel like you're more at one of the extreme ends, going away from the centrist position on Butler, someone on the extreme end, but unlike the extreme positive end, the extreme negative end? I'll give you like one of mine is JJ Arcega-Whiteside. Right? I have no problem with JJ Arcega-Whiteside as an NFL commodity. I just think he has a limited application. Now, granted, here's someone like Cooper Kupp where you say, well, limited application, but if a team makes that essential to their offense, now you have production like a slot machine. So when we're using production as the final rating of how a receiver does, I still think that, yeah, sure, in an ideal situation, some of these contributor receivers can put up massive numbers. So that's an example where I think I'm down more at the bottom. Who's someone where you're more down at the bottom?
Well, it's hard to say because the rankings are so different, in terms of where I am versus where everybody else is. I think one guy that I could see his evaluation going a few different directions, and I think we actually might disagree on him too, is Deebo Samuel. So Deebo Samuel, I think I have a very, very clear idea of how I'd want him to be used. And another name that no one's going to like, this is what I love about player comparisons, because like, unless you make like a really exciting player comparison, people don't really care. But Chris Hogan's a guy that comes to mind with Deebo Samuel, because I don't know that they necessarily play the same. That's not necessarily what I'm saying, but I think of Chris Hogan, another guy that's coming down off a down season, but Chris Hogan at his best was a guy who could play multiple different roles for the Patriots. We saw him play X receiver and be their deep threat the year before Brandon Cooks arrived. Then the year that Julian Edelman was out, we see him play more inside, face more zone coverage, still be a bit of a vertical threat. And I think that with Deebo Samuel, I think there are some routes he's very, very good on. I think he's solid getting off the line of scrimmage. I see him being a very like league average separator and being a really nice role player, but I see other people will rank him like top 5 in the class, and I don't necessarily see that from him, but I see him being a really nice role player for many, many years, much like a Chris Hogan, who now he coming off 2018, he couldn't get open, at all. But back in his good seasons, 2017 and 2016, again, league average separator who could play multiple different positions. And I see that being what Deebo Samuel is, but probably a bit better of a player after the catch than Chris Hogan ever was, for sure.
Yeah, and you see with Chris Hogan the range of outcomes, right? Because for 8 games, when he was pressed into that role in a good pass offense that was living off of some of the things that Rob Gronkowski, for one, creates distortions in the defense to exploit, he was I traded him for Derrick Henry at the peak in a dynasty league. But then immediately he falls off the cliff because the margins are smaller when you're league average at these kinds of things. New Panther, which of course is in your rearview mirror. We could go on a whole side topic on that and really turn this to a couch session, but we're not. But I love that. Didn't someone for the Panthers bring up separation as the key component for wide receivers earlier this week? Didn't that happen
Yeah.
again?
Marty Herney
Yeah,
said that this
yeah,
week.
and you love that too. And I think that this is one of those cases where, um, it's funny how life bears out. Where you did reception perception, and it could have been called separation perception.
Yeah.
I mean, what I mean by that is, if we were going to, again, I'm going to put you on the couch here, but you were very much about separation as the goal that you're panning for when you're looking at these guys and what you're studying for. Um, and now that seems to be, we talk about last year in the bloodshed with the big wide receivers. A lot of that's because the big wide receivers you talk about are Sega Whiteside, I think, and Keel Harry, Kelvin Harmon. These are the guys where if separation is what you're looking for, these aren't guys that are going to get big check marks for separation. Um, just in a general way, and take it wherever you want to. Run with that topic. The idea that is the NFL valuing separation the way that you basically were 5-6 years ago, and they should have been all along.
Yeah, because I think that, oh man, there's a lot of different
Yeah.
directions that we can take this. But the easiest one to say is, look, the job of every NFL team right now, and I think they have figured this out, is we have to make our quarterback's life easier.
Yes.
We have to make, like, why are we why are we taking our most valuable, precious commodity and not doing absolutely everything we can to make this person's life easier? And let's spin it to the Carolina Panthers, because it's the team that I know very well. They have done perhaps the worst job of that of any team that has drafted a young quarterback. They consistently have put Cam Newton around teams that have poor wide receivers. They've consistently put him behind bad offensive lines, especially last season, which leads to injuries and, I hope not a shortened career for the player. And worst of all is the offensive design that he's played under for the majority of his career. I don't think any quarterback, of these guys that are still active in our life right now has had to make more low degree of, or low percentage, high degree of difficulty throws than Cam Newton. And part of that is offensive scheme and system, no doubt about it. I mean, Sean McVay has been great about that. Even the Chiefs with Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes have been great about putting in layup throws for the quarterback. Cam Newton didn't have a lot of layup throws until Christian McCaffrey arrived. But another way that you can do that is by getting wide receivers who can quickly separate in routes. I mean, it was just, I like to say that I hated Dave Gettleman before it was cool.
Evidence,
Because
picks, or it didn't happen.
Well, because look, I mean, think about what he was doing at the wide receiver position,
Right.
position that I love the most.
Big catch radius.
Yeah, his idea was to get these big lumbering twin towers out there because, well, our quarterback misses high, and then so what we got to do is, get these big catch radiuses. That's just and overcorrected on that for sure. So I think that by providing these receivers who can get open, who can get quick separation, that is the key to making your quarterback's life a little easier. And I also think too, just from the more complicated perspective, our brains overweight, highlight moments, both on the positive and negative side. So when we see a receiver who wins a lot of contested passes, those are big highlight moments that we want to hold on to. Same thing when we see a receiver drop a lot of easy passes. Those are real highlight negative moments that we want to hold on to. I wrote this piece, Backyard Banter years ago about drops, and it's an important point in this year's class, especially with a player like Hakeem Butler. Our brain overweights those negative moments even more than the positive moments, but still, big plays like yards after catch are the same thing with the contested passes. We overweight those things because we see them on Sundays. They get drilled into our brain. But what we don't see, unless you're me and you've charted over 46,000 routes over the last 5 years among NFL players alone, you're not watching the consistent good route running, the separation. But that is the lifeblood to creating good offense for your quarterback. So, yeah, to me, I think the NFL is coming around on this. But it doesn't just mean like, okay, now we need to emphasize small receivers only, because there are some big receivers who can create separation, beyond the Miles Boykins, beyond the AJ Greens, even the Hakeem Butlers to this degree. Some of these guys, some of those guys that you just mentioned, I think the ones who are good off the line of scrimmage, they can create quick separation, even if they're not going to be sustaining separators down the route tree.
Right. And you brought up good points about the offense and using that quick separation to make your life easier as a quarterback. But and how contested catches stand out. Uh, but how important is that? Well, and this is why I think I said on an earlier show that the fade should just be ripped out of the goal line playbook. Like they're just plays. I don't care how good the guy is on the fade. They're just better,
Yeah.
less risky play.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just not a hyper. It's just not a play that where you can create lots of better propositions on the field. And so you don't want contested outside of the broken play where you're trying to make something happen, a chunk play downfield outside of the structure, you're throwing it up. Um, you don't really want to create contested catches as part of your
No.
offense, you know?
Yeah,
So,
and oh, by the way, talk about filling in
yeah,
I think Adam Harstead has done a good job, like
sure.
years ago, writing about this, like how we kind of fill in the blanks for players. And I think contested catches are a great example of that, because you see a guy in a lot of contested situations, your brain fills in the blank to, oh, well, how does he land there? Well, because he doesn't get separation.
Right.
That's not always necessarily true. And I will once again go back to AJ Green in this point. You see AJ Green make a lot of contested catches in a lot more situations than any other player. But that's not because he's not a great route runner. That's not because he's not, getting separation. That's the type of targets, and the player delivering those targets can also force you into those contested situations.
Right, right. And this is one of those things that, well, the quarterback changes the outcome of the player's career, or at least what's important about it, right?
Yeah.
Because that's where, again, the ideal scouting report is give me an accurate picture of all these areas of a player's game. And then the moment we know where they're going to land, we can say, oh, well, with that quarterback, and in this Gettleman conversation is a good idea of how the coaches can misassess a player, and then it makes their personnel priorities misassessed. It just makes the whole offense a mess. You're trying to play to things that are either non-existent or just unwise things to play to, instead of doing simpler things like creating those layups. Hey, Norv Turner, lots of praise for Norv Turner, and maybe in some ways they kind of luck into what Christian McCaffrey is, because I don't know it was their intent. You know, Matt, it's like it reminds me of playing video games. I don't play a lot of video games anymore. I think I'd probably get consumed completely by them, like the girl in the TV and Poltergeist or something. If I did like the intense, dense video games, and maybe because video games that I remember from when I was a kid were simpler, sometimes you would just find something that worked and you would just keep doing it, even though it was really simple minded. And maybe the NFL is so complex now that just taking those easy passes and having a player like Christian McCaffrey, who between his awareness and his ball skills and his ability after the catch can add a lot of value to those kind of plays. And I don't know if that was their intent to make it a cornerstone of their offense, but here's to rational coaching, making the things you invest the most in the cornerstones of your offenses. So it is going to be interesting to see how these receivers are applied. I guess talking more about that, AJ Brown is a guy that almost no matter how you apply him, he's going to be successful. He's got enough coverage of enough different parts of the game. Um, who's somebody who you feel more like the story you want to tell is, well, in this situation, we're really going to like this player, but I can also see places where we're going to look at him as a bust.
Yeah, it's N'Keal Harry to me, because
Mm,
we talked about Juju Smith-Schuster at the beginning of the show as it applies to AJ Brown. And I think that, I don't know, maybe I'm still being too hard on Juju Smith-Schuster as a player, that could face press man coverage, but I still think we haven't seen a lot of evidence that he's that type of player. And I think
right.
the data that I track with reception perception in his first 2 years, he's a great freaking player. But he still shows very poorly when he has to go against man or press coverage. But again, it doesn't really matter because he doesn't have to do it at the rate of most receivers in the NFL. So who cares? Now, I think AJ Brown could thrive outside of that. I'm not so sure N'Keal Harry is that player. N'Keal Harry, I think, if you use him the right way, if you use him as that Juju Smith-Schuster type, the Larry Fitzgerald later part of his career, if he can make that transition. And I want to give a shout out to Matt Caraccio, who tweeted this to me, a couple weeks ago. Are we too cavalier with just assuming that we can, like, a player can just do that? A job
Mhm.
that he's not used to doing. Can he just make that
Yeah,
transition?
Fitzgerald's an all-time great.
Right,
So
right,
when
an
you invoke his
all-time great.
name, do it. Yeah. So if he can do something, that means very few guys can do it.
Right. And like also I could sit here and be like, well, Reggie Wayne did it, another all-time great,
Yeah. Right.
so great. I mean, some of these players have done it at least coming into the, Juju's a great example, has done that coming into the NFL. Adam Thielen, I think, is another example that
Oh,
you
got
could
that
say,
extension.
right, and good.
Tryout player to one of the best in the league.
And he, by the way, is fascinating because I think he gets this rap probably because he's white as like and his story too, like gritty hard worker, and he very may well be. But I remember the first year that I looked at Adam Thielen when he wasn't playing that big slot role, because I think we forget that going into the 2016 season, I think either 2016 or 2017. I might have those mixed up. I think it was 2017. Yeah, going into that year, it was Stephon Diggs was going to play the slot and Adam Thielen was going to be their outside receiver, because that's how it was in 2016, right? And then people freaked out when it was like Stephon Diggs was going to be the outside receiver. I can't tell. I remember I've never been more bombarded with tweets about should I be worried about Stephon Diggs playing outside?
Hand
And I'm
wringing.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, right. And I'm like, no. This is one of the best route runners in the league. He'll be able to create separation. Don't worry about it. But people were freaked out about that. And the more interesting one to me was Adam Thielen, because I remember thinking, I think this transition is more about him, because back in 2016, Thielen was this. I thought he was like a freak show athlete, like almost like an Alshon Jeffrey type of player. This big, deep threat wide receiver who could win contested passes, but wasn't creating a lot of separation against press man coverage on the outside on a routine basis. Then they move him inside, and he's an all pro. He's just a total absolute stud. So I thought that transition was more about him. So he's at least another one that you could point to as, I mean, maybe he ends up being an all-time great, but a guy who in his younger years has made that transition. So how that relates to N'Keal Harry is he's a guy that you see do that a little bit in college, be that big slot receiver, and I think those are really good reps for him. But he's mostly an outside guy. He's mostly somebody that I think does have to make a projection, a transition in that way, because I just don't think I think JJ Arcega-Whiteside, I think Kelvin Harmon, I think both of those guys get off the line of scrimmage early in their routes against press coverage than N'Keal Harry does, which is why I would be comfortable playing them on the outside. But I'm not necessarily convinced that N'Keal Harry can do it. Also, I don't think it's what his best fit is. So to me, I think he has a great ceiling. I really like him. He's one that I'm worried about in terms of role. Like, I just hope he gets to the right place.
I would totally agree with that. And watching Harry, it's just as simple as for a big guy, he's a good mover after the catch. And he's got a good aggressive mindset there and at the catch point. And he plays so big at the catch point that it's almost unfair to ask some of these defensive backs to make a play on the ball. So if you're hinging off of those parts of his game, and honestly, get him involved more to run after the catch, you are looking at him as more of a big slot, although he's not going to be that nifty separator in the slot. So you are changing your offense by putting him in the slot. Then even the guys who've been good big slots, we're still doing it with route running and separation. That's not going to be what you're asking Harry to do, because it's not the strength of his game. And he just doesn't do, in Matt Waldman terms, telling a story with your routes.
No, yeah.
He's just not engaged in that part of the game. Matt, I know that, and maybe we can use this time as we get close to the end of our wonderful hour together.
I got time, man. I got time.
Oh, good.
I'm in my remote location.
That's right. That's right. Coming to you from a remote location. Well, good, because this is the kind of topic, Matt, where we can really start talking about, again, stepping out another level of abstraction, where I know that you talk about the number of hours, the number of plays you've watched, that things start to emerge where you see a deeper pattern. It's like instead of seeing the stars, you see the Milky Way, And one of those things is you just see how a guy goes about his job in a general way, in the same way that we can watch anybody doing any job and understand more. Like, these are the parts of the job that there's self-motivation and great application. These are the parts of the job that just don't interest them, or otherwise isn't how they choose to go about accomplishing this job. You start at point A, you have to get to point B, accomplish this thing. And really, you can categorize information about wide receivers and make it systematic, because that kind of presentation is what a lot of people want. But there is not a sense of narrative in the way we get into like I saw the great story about Hakeem Butler that somebody retweeted this morning that his life circumstances explain to some extent why he's a late breakout player, why he's a
Yeah,
1 year wonder. So if you're going to use that against him, you have to at least mention that or understand the context and narrative. So narrative belongs in player evaluation for that reason.
for
But
sure.
there's also this idea of like just again, like I'll go back to like getting a player, and you watch Harry, and you just see that like that element of being a receiver is not. I mean, one of the things that always comes to mind, I think, is very underrated when evaluating receivers, Matt, is changing speeds. I mean, I hate seeing a monotone receiver, a
Yeah.
monotone runner, because that's the easiest receiver to stick to in the NFL. But even receivers who don't have a true second gear or a top speed that is threatening in the NFL, if they can change speeds, that's extremely useful. And look, part of changing speeds isn't just being able to throttle down or throttle up or have different gears, but it's understanding from a mental standpoint what your opponent is anticipating. Trying to create a false anticipation in them. Again, that part of it telling a story. So when I talk about all this, I mean, does it apply? Do you start to see these patterns where you just understand that there are these archetypes? Matt Waldman talks a lot about archetypes of how these guys go about their job, and it helps you understand them immediately and contextualize the rest of what they're doing.
Yeah, yeah, this is a very on the couch thing to say,
Yeah,
but like I think that I chart these receivers and I almost, you put them into a statistic, success rate versus coverage, success rate versus man, zone,
right.
press, whatever, all the routes. But some of these guys arrive to that conclusion in very different ways, right? Like, and that's almost like you wonder, man, am I cheapening what these guys do by trying to put them into a number? No, I don't think so, because I think I can talk myself out of that. I can sit with my therapist and say,
Well,
no, 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 no. Yeah,
partially because you can embrace the other side too. Because there's another element here
yeah,
too that with your job has gotten you more access to actually like sit down and pick these guys' brains and understand even
yes,
better what makes them tick as humans.
absolutely. I mean, for sure, and that's been great. That's been great to talk to players like Stephon Diggs, talk to players like Antonio Brown, talk to players like Odell Beckham about the game, and that's been very cool. I'm very, very fortunate to be able to do that. Now, like, I think it's just funny to think about these players from a very qualitative sense of, like you're saying, watching how they go about their business and how they get the task done. Golden Tate, someone who stands out to me as someone that, I can put him in reception perception and he looks like every other slot receiver, not great against man coverage, but solid finding holes in zones, whatever. But then you watch Golden Tate, and he's such a badass. He's
Yeah.
so combative. He's great at winning those contested passes. He will do things like, he'll break a couple tackles, then finally go down on the third tackle attempt, and then he'll, pat the defender on the head. He'll do stuff like that, which just makes you love his game that much more, because it's that combative sense that I really like to see out of players. There are some guys that how they get open on the slant route or how they get open on the curl route is drastically different than how another player does it, which is why, yeah, I mean, as great as it is to put charts and metrics and data out, it's always fun to tell the story of how they arrive at that conclusion, which is something I always try to do.
No, it's great to watch too because I love that you talked about combativeness, and I still think that at every position, we all have our spreadsheet or something like that where we're taking notes as we watch players. There should be a column for toughness, and toughness is sometimes is the rug that ties the room together. Toughness is the thing that can unlock a lot of ability to alter, influence a play, which alters or influences the game. And it can also be the lack of it can be an obstacle. We hear finesse player and things like that. It can be an obstacle, and it's not necessarily just about the toughness, but it's also about the motor running hot and playing with a sense of urgency and playing with an intensity and focus that you just see that you like it, and I think it translates more to the next level, and it absolutely applies at wide receiver, even though it's a position where they're out on an island, and it's a position where finesse can often be very useful in the toolbox.
And Bloom too.
Yeah, yeah,
On that note, like, why I love combining, charted out data like reception perception with the stories of players is because I don't think there's again, maybe this is my bias showing
Yeah.
because this is my position or whatever, but I don't think there's any other position that also gets kind of like we'll see players get degraded or misunderstood, it might be a better word,
Hmm.
based on narratives of their game.
Right.
Because, and this is, I mean, God, this is like harkening back to why I wanted to do this series in general. Because wide receivers, are, they run off the screen on Sundays.
Hmm.
Most fans are not, God bless them, and I wouldn't encourage you to do this. Have a life, please. Aren't charting 46,000 routes over the last 5 years or whatever I said. Like people aren't really studying the position that way, in which not everybody is out there breaking down film. Most fans are just relying on what commentators tell them because, again, they run off screen. We don't understand them. We just see them in these highlight moments. And a player like Des Bryant is a great example of that. When Dez fell off the cliff, and I showed this in reception perception, how he fell below the 10th percentile in success rate versus man and press coverage. And then the Cowboys released him, and it took forever for him to sign because he couldn't get open anymore because in my opinion, because he was done. People would say, well, Dez has just always been a jump ball receiver. So why does this matter all that much? Because that's just not true. Like Des Bryant, yes, his trump card trait is the fact that he could win those 50-50 balls. He was a beast there. But while it's true also that Des Bryant wasn't a great separator, I mean, he wasn't a great route runner, he wasn't a
Yeah.
great technician. He got open on a routine basis because he's a freak, because he would run 4 routes and, he would get separation on those. He'd run a slant. And because he was tough as hell at the line of scrimmage, could get off press and then quickly get into the route, he would be a great target on slant patterns. He could run the post, he could run the 9, he could run the curl, but that's about it because he's not this great technician. And that to me is he's a perfect example of a player that gets very misunderstood. And I'm going to relate this back to 2 players in this draft class with this Des Bryant example because I mentioned I talked to Daniel Jeremiah a decent amount because we became good at evaluating players together at the NFL when we'd go back and forth on these receivers. He mentioned N'Keal Harry as a comparison for Des Bryant. And I don't see that at all. And I would say this to DJ's face, so it's no big deal. But like
Ha.
I don't see that comparison at all with N'Keal Harry when he mentioned this to me because yes, he does have that ability to win contested passes, but he doesn't have the explosion that Des Bryant brings and the ability to separate first press because simply how tough he is and how he explodes in and out of breaks, even if he's not this great nuanced technician like an Antonio Brown. But who does very
Yeah.
similar, checks those boxes to me is DK Metcalf. I
Hmm.
think DK Metcalf, maybe I'm breaking my own rule earlier about not wanting to compare a player to AJ Green, but I think DK Metcalf in a high range of outcomes can be a Des Bryant type of player because he's tough as hell off the line of scrimmage. I think that doesn't get discussed enough with him, but he's so explosive that I think on those limited handful of routes, especially if he gets moved around a lot, I think he's going to create a lot of separation, even if he's not a great nuanced technician player. I don't know how you feel about that, but
Yeah. Yeah.
that's what to me is so fun about the wide receiver position is that I think it gets misunderstood. Players get misunderstood
Hmm.
because of narratives, but when you can make fun comparisons like that when you really study a player like a Des Bryant, who I think we remember poorly based on how his career has kind of petered off here.
Right. The why, like it's when we think of the why and what made them great and memorable. And on Metcalf, I mean, Metcalf is in some ways, I think, a really simple evaluation.
Yeah,
Stephen White is. I mentioned him a lot this time of year because it's great when a former player brings that enthusiasm and excitement, but also the perspective of a former player. And just like who cares? Okay, he can't do that. Well, you're not going to use him to do that anyway.
yeah,
He's
yeah,
he's really good at these things, and that's what you're going to do with him, and it's going to help your team win. I've compared him to a broadsword where you need some strength and power to swing it, but you can take someone's head off, and you don't use it for close in range fighting and things like that. But that's not what a broadsword's for. It's for chopping chopping off those heads. Game of Thrones time, right? Here we go.
yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah,
always
yeah,
behind
yeah.
us. So, but anyway, my point is, I think you're right to talk about the why and things like that and get off into Metcalf. But it cuts both ways, that sword. Because and what I really like about this is I'm picturing you, as you were talking about this, Matt, I'm picturing you doing what you do and something akin to that for other people where if you could just, because even when we're watching cut ups on YouTube, we're still watching game film. But if you could just watch the tape of a camera that is isolated on the receiver for every play without the context of anything else that's happening, you would think about a receiver way differently than you think about them from what you see just on the 4 plays where they're targeted.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And that's important because what you do and any of us, I mean, we would all watch a player and pick a receiver. It would be fun. Just pick a receiver. And what would even be better, I think Matt Waldman and I have talked about this, is that there's some sort of technology where the player would be altered so that you wouldn't see the uniform or the body type, or maybe you could pick out a player by the way they move. And that's something I think that you probably can do from all the time you spend in. But the point is, like, you would be shocked sometimes if you watched every rep of a wide receiver and have a whole different sense of him than those 5 or 6 plays. But the other side of that sword is the reality is those are the 5 or 6 plays that matter. And your performance on those plays should eclipse your performance on all those other plays. But at the same time, for those kinds of players, when it falls, it can fall quickly. But there's that idea of when the all eyes are on you, what you can summon up. Like you brought up Adam Thielen. I was just reading more about him today, just in the on the occasion of his extension this week. And you're absolutely right. We're telling the story of Adam Thielen. He's a great athlete, by the way.
Yeah.
He's not overcoming subpar athleticism for an NFL receiver. And they saw that. And also, quickly as an aside, because we're going to turn the page to the draft next week, and the next thing we're going to turn the page to is rookie mini camps. And he made the team in a rookie mini camp. And then the next thing we're going to talk about after that is OTAs. And we're going to be watching rookies blurbs from beat writers. And people are going to say, it's just OTAs. Okay. But one of the things they go back to in that story, Matt, is that when Adam Thielen was bringing it against Xavier Rhodes, and I mean, it might have even been in the rookie minicamp. I think it was. Rhodes and Thielen came in the league around the same time. My brain is so unreliable. It might have been in the rookie minicamp. Okay. I think it was because it was the same draft as Patterson. So I think those guys all came in together. Okay. And when the blurb comes out of rookie minicamp that Adam Thielen is winning against Xavier Rhodes, if you would have pointed at that and said, maybe we should keep tabs on this Thielen guy, a lot of people, it's just rookie minicamp. So what? And that was your first indicator. And the Vikings player said, when we saw that, we said, we got to sign this Thielen kid. And they said he stood out as fast. He stood out as someone who just understood how to get open in the defense. And you mentioned the alteration in his career. So, there are parts of these stories that when you go back and you see the success of a player, there are things that are important. And it is going to be outstanding to get to see what these players do in their first NFL environment. We're at an hour, but you said we can keep going. So I'll just ask you this, because you're human and you have your passion and your enthusiasm about this. Give me a guy from this class that you just really liked watching.
That I just really liked watching. Stanley Morgan Jr. from Nebraska. Just a real treat in a number of different ways. This is the funny thing too. Like, I'm a human being, right? Like, spoiler alert. I'm a human being. Like, there are players that when I chart them for reception, NFL guys, as soon as I get to the first game, I'm like, oh my God, I can't wait to get to the end. Because they're just they might be good players, but they're just boring. Like sorry, Julian Edelman. I don't need to see the next 7 games of your sample. Like, I know I've got you figured out, buddy. Like that. Same with a player. I don't know. Paris Campbell is an example from this class.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is a boring watch.
Right.
And that almost maybe from a prospect perspective should then challenge you to think, hey, I better really watch this carefully, actually, because he's doing the same thing over and over again. I really need to discover if there's anything more here. So maybe that actually should challenge you if you're finding yourself bored in an evaluation to really focus harder. I don't know. I'm probably not the right person to ask for that. But Stanley Morgan Jr., on the other hand, immediately captivating because talk about combative, talk about aggressive in routes. You see him line up at multiple different positions. You see him excel in multiple different ways. You see him get off press coverage pretty well. You see him run really good routes at the stem. You see him win contested passes. I think he is a player that look, I've been getting very nihilistic about the draft this year because I'm working with a lot of new coworkers, some of whom, you know, aren't as familiar with the NFL or sports as much as I would be, coming from different sectors to try to bring new ideas to the sports media landscape, which is desperately needed, by the way.
Yeah. Keep trying, folks. The boat's not full. The door's not closed. If you've got ideas, make those ideas happen. Yeah.
We need them. We need new, fresh ideas. I've explained to people like, hey, we're about to do this draft podcast, or hey, we're about to shoot this draft video that I shot yesterday about players. I'm like, let me tell you what the reality of this situation is. Is we are going to talk about, let's say we're going to talk 10 players in this podcast. We're going to talk 10 players in this video. This will probably be the last time we ever talk about 90% of them. Mm-hmm. This is just the reality of draft analysis. And so what I look for in a guy like Stanley Morgan Jr., who's probably going to go on day 3, is I see a coaching staff being convinced that he brings something to the table that is more valuable than like, oh, this is just a good receiver. And I think the versatility, I think the ability to excel in all areas, or at least be competent and show some potential hints of a trump card in all different areas, that's something that I think a coaching staff could really buy into.
And you have this idea, I think of these things. One of the distinctions I find myself making a lot to try to understand what these players offer is the idea of harvesting or preserving the value of a play. So just doing your job in a way that if the play works as designed and everyone else does their job, you'll create the production that play is designed to create. And adding value, doing things that are above the mean, and making that guy miss after the catch, or winning the contested catch, or having the speed to pull away, or whatever it is that adds value. And I think you're right to look at a player like Stanley Morgan and think that there's the little, down here in Louisiana, they would say lanyap, a little, I might be saying it wrong. I might be embarrassing myself. I shouldn't be doing that just after moving here like 4 months ago. I have to I think I didn't say y'all until like 3 years after I moved to Texas, even though I wanted to say it earlier. Anyway, you see those little extra things, the little extras, the added value, but you also know that athletically, there's nothing that's going to so greatly surpass. Like, it's just the way you say with a little bit of resignation in your voice, he's a 3rd day pick. But who also was a 3rd day pick? Rashard Higgins. He's doing all right. He's doing all right. And I mean, I'm not comparing Morgan to Higgins per se. I'm just saying that when you see limitations, you should. I mean, it's this idea, and Josh Norris, tip of the cap to him, talking about where he wins. It's positive thinking, and I think that you're hearing more and more of this coming from the NFL, this idea of don't tell me what he can't do, tell me what he can do, and then we can make something out of that. So it's a combination of both of those things, and of course, it should shock nobody that Matt Waldman, also a big fan of Stanley Morgan Jr. We're getting all these great juniors, Reggie White Jr.
Yeah,
we're getting all these great juniors in this class. But man, you're not a junior anymore. It's fun. You talk about going back to 2013, 2014 when you were just starting reception perception. And now you're also talking about yourself as one of the people, like among your colleagues and things, that you feel like your knowledge is deep enough that you almost have to scale it back a little bit to talk a language that other people in sports media are going to understand, because they're not drilling as deep as we are. But at the same time, when we talk about separation, we talk about tell me what he can do in positive things, we talk about the directions offenses go. Where I've always loved the draft, and I think the tribe of the draft always met at watching football and being in a cerebral way stimulated by it, and wanting to peel away the initial layer, the surface layer that everybody interacts with it on, the score of the game or the stats and so on, and really get to what is underneath that. And you've done an incredible job at it. So we'll go into media mode. I know for you it's probably refreshing to be like out of media mode, but I know you've got a Game of Thrones thing. I don't even know why I act like there's any reason that people are listening to us like that. Like you've surpassed everybody already knows what Matt Harmon is doing. People who've never heard of On the Couch and Football Guys know what Matt Harmon's doing. But you do have a new team, the San Francisco 49ers, and I think that's the reason. Did you see, Matt? First of all, did you see, by the way, that Josh Jacobs said that Julio Jones taught him how to be a receiver.
I saw Charles' piece about that.
Yeah,
I haven't
that
read
automatically went up. Like he went up, like he was already up in my rank, and he's going up even more. But I did see that the initial Caesars, I think, odds, Super Bowl odds were out, and the 49ers were ridiculous, like 12-1, like fifth or sixth. And I think that's the Matt Harmon bump, right?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Anyway, so you've had that, but you've got now you're doing Game of Thrones, and I could probably jump into a conversation about Game of Thrones like 4 years ago, but not so much now. Not enough time for that these days. But you're also going to be at the draft. I know Reception Perception is at Fantasy Footballers again this year, and all these things. It's springtime, and the flowers are all coming up through the soil, and here we are.
Yeah, I mean, when you say it like that, I'm like, man, I got a lot to do.
This is supposed to be the downtime.
Yeah, right. Well, I always used to joke about that. I joke about that with Waldman all the time because he is now in his moment where after the draft, he's like, put out the post-draft RSP, and then I'm good. And that's when most people, I feel like, start to kind of kick back a little bit. Is right after the draft. And I am dreading the month of May because that's when it's like, okay, my June 1st deadline for the ultimate draft kit, for Reception Perception to come out. That's that day. So everybody I start to see people like, yeah, May, taking it easy. This is the downtime. No way, man. This is when I've got to chart out like 20 more players, bang through a ton of samples. There's a lot of work to be done. However, as you mentioned, a lot going on, a lot to be excited about. The Game of Thrones show. The Game of Thrones show. I said this to you on the phone the other day.
Did you like Atlanta's schedule thing? Did you see the Atlanta schedule thing?
Oh, yeah. It's great. Like, NFL teams are starting to have a little bit more fun, which is nice to see. They're unloosening the buttons a little bit. Look, the NFL. This is a different topic, but coming from the NFL Network to Yahoo now, and like being at least a little bit more familiar with other sports. I'm never going to analyze other sports because I just don't care and I don't have the time. You just mentioned all that stuff I got to do. Yeah. I certainly don't have the time to start cranking out baseball statistics, nor do I have the desire. Although I've decided I'm pro bat flipping. So,
by the way, this offseason has not at all resembled you in Carbonite. False advertising.
No, that was big false advertising, but was very funny. So I think the NFL is starting to realize a little bit like, hey, the Antonio Brown thing is a great example of this. Like, hey, if there's drama, if there's conflict, if there's players going back and forth on social media, if there's teams doing fun things on social media, that's why the NBA has taken itself to another level. I think the NFL does see that, and even though the NFL is very arrogant, and they've earned that arrogance of being like, hey, we never, no matter what happens, we're always going to churn the profits. Fingers crossed, no work stoppage, anything like that. But, that's probably the case. But I think they see that there's another tier for them to jump because of examples from other sports. And so the Game of Thrones thing is a great example. But yeah, the Game of Thrones thing, I said this to you, hashtag Bet the Realm is the show every Monday, 10 a.m. Pacific, live show with at LeJethro Jenkins, John Nichols on Twitter, our NBA Yahoo social editor here, with a special guest every week. Biggest coup of my entire career getting that green lit. But it's a blast, man. I'm having fun doing all the things I'm doing. And I'm eternally grateful that I get to operate in this space. There's no doubt. I'm very, very fortunate. I just want to keep working hard and earning it.
Well, and it's because it's about relationships and connections, and the entities that are embracing that and feeding that and engaging and cultivating that will continue to bear harvest the fruits of those relationships. Yeah, and you're right. The NFL's having some more fun. People are very engaged, and it always, to me, and it also is on the occasion they go on to the draft, you can just see that it's the NHL playoffs, it's the NBA playoffs, baseball's in full swing now, and the NFL draft is front page in every NFL city and not in some non-NFL cities on the day of the draft. And we'll all be talking about Kyler Murray in Arizona, and we'll all be talking about any number of other things. It is just people care. Like, it's so interesting, Matt. I'm always on the couch. I'm always analyzing myself. I always talk about, and I'll do a sorry Joe, because I always would joke that I will write the New York Times bestseller, top 10 nonfiction book. It's titled "Give a Shit." That's the secret. That's the secret ingredient.
Yeah.
And is caring. And people really care about the NFL. People really care about Game of Thrones. People really care about each other. And we've been lucky, I think, in some ways to not know any better, Cecil and I, and some of the other people that have caught in the fantasy football space, because there's one story and layer of this football and media and fantasy football media and all of these things of like your stats, your metrics that you made up, your how accurate you are. You know, do you help people win money now with DFS, a lot of money, and so on. But there's another story that is just as real and maybe more determinative, that is about human beings connecting with each other and engaging with each other and validating each other's existence. And it's fun, man. It's fun to watch because I think that presence in any number of arenas. And you know, we had when you still to this day, you're like a inspiring person for people that are making big personal changes. And who knows what will come down the road for you and for me and for any of us. But staying engaged in those things that we care about, actually caring, is the
Yeah.
thing that makes the gears of the universe move and makes things start to happen and reveal themselves. Go ahead.
I will say just a note on that. Like I was on a health and wellness podcast recently, and they kind of one of the things they asked me was like, you were a person that while you were developing reception perception, while I was cranking that out, while I was ready to release that to the public, I was in by far the darkest time of my life from a mental health perspective, and like was someone that was just I lived I called myself the mayor of the town self-doubt,
Mm-hmm.
like so they asked me like, how did you get the courage to like put something out there that people could have, reception perception could have absolutely shredded, could have ripped it apart,
Yeah.
if it was terrible? How would I possibly be able to recover from that? The answer is probably I wouldn't have been able to recover from that, but luckily, like, our community, you know the fantasy football community, the football Twitter world in general, I think I just had the confidence that, not in myself necessarily, but like I think these people are gonna like what I have to say because they're welcoming. Because I have been welcomed by people like Sigmund Bloom, but by people like Sal Stefanelli. They've told me, I think that, like, if you have an idea, you should put it out there. And I will just always be indebted, and my cap is eternally tipped to this community that we are belonging to, because not only I think it was last preseason, Evan Silva said this on your podcast, that like people are just doing the absolute best work about football. That's definitely true. And I would also say it's the most welcoming community that I've ever been a part of too. And it is that, sorry, Joe, give a shit mentality too.
Yeah.
Like, people care about this, and you know what? Like, I think that beyond being the smartest football person in the room, beyond being reception perception, like bringing insights, like everybody just wants, people that we follow and participate in this community with. People want to quote my favorite band, Dawes, we want someone to make the day's move easy, and
Mm-hmm.
like I think that's what we're all doing for each other out
Yeah.
here, and it's a beautiful thing. And again, I'm eternally grateful to be a small part of it.
Yeah, it is. I think on my Twitter page, I have like the was Vonnegut's brother saying, we're all here to help each other, through this, whatever it is, with that resignation. Joe likes to do a quote, and I'll botch it because I botch quotes because my brain is addled. That's like we're all walking each other home at night or something like that. It is what this is all about. Whatever we're talking about on the surface, it's that presence. And I swear that podcasts continue to rise because the sound of people's voices helps stave off loneliness. And you can be
Yeah,
surrounded by people and still be lonely. So it isn't
yeah,
about being isolated, but also for the football analysis and everything that we learn and it reveals, like minds sparking each other creates more interesting and complex truths to understand than just one person on their own. Like, at the beginning of There Will Be Blood, like just going off into the desert by yourself and doing it yourself. Great discoveries happen that way. But together, we discover things that we can't on our own. And so it's always great to get together with people like Matt Harmon. A week from tonight, it'll be me and Matt Waldman and who knows who else. And Matt, you're going to be doing your thing with Yahoo. You're going to be out there.
oh, I'll be out there, baby.
Yeah.
If anyone is at the NFL draft, let me know. I'm down to down to clown, basically.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. I'm glad you said that because I was gonna say, so if anybody, because this is our community. If anybody out there wants to find you in Nashville, can they just find you? And you just said it for me because I was afraid, like, oh man, am I bringing more? Because you've got your Matt Harmon crew, which I am always a part of, and we're happy that you're part of our crew. Matt Harmon's crew, my crew, Matt Waldman, everybody, Football Guys crew. So the draft is here. It's going to be exciting. And then we keep turning the pages to always new and exciting things. We do that for you because you're that lifeblood. You're that positivity that we're all harvesting, creating, and projecting out there. It all comes from you, and you listening right now, you watching right now. Thank you, folks. Always, please stay the classiest.